I'm Andy Derman, Managing Director of Emsi in the UK. Welcome to this Emsi Learn module, helping you to get the most out of your work with Emsi.
Hi everybody, my name is John Gray, Director of Further Education at Emsi. Today's session is going to cover things to consider when using LMI for curriculum alignment. So that could be curriculum planning or developing a curriculum strategy. Agenda for the session: first we're going to look at some objectives, then we're going to look to why use LMI in curriculum planning and curriculum strategy. Next we'll consider how you will use LMI in your planning process, and then finally harnessing LMI to drive action. So in terms of the objectives, we've got three key goals for the session. First is to understand the importance of LMI when using the data for curriculum planning or curriculum strategy. Second is the integration of LMI into your curriculum planning process. And third, considering next steps for a successful implementation. And we know from experience how important that stage is. Spending time getting the implementation right will give you great success when you get to use the data. So why use LMI in curriculum planning or curriculum strategy? So we're just going to pause a second for you to consider what you think. So some key themes. So first of all, in the bottom left corner there, we have Ofsted. So depending on where you are across the UK, you may have another regulatory power in place. But the principle is going to be very similar, and we're going to look at Ofsted as an example in the next slide. Next, student outcomes. So more and more now it's important that curriculum is aligned to student outcomes, destinations, making sure that students get the jobs which are needed within the economy. Business community, so making sure that curriculum is relevant and that it's going to meet the needs of local businesses, local organisations, and that gives the college a good reputation. But overarching all of that is fulfilling the institution's mission. So, really looking at that kind of social and economic impact which the college has within the economy. So looking at Ofsted as an example, here are just a few of the key points that we've taken from the recent inspection handbook. And we've underlined there some of the kind of key statements, but overall it's about preparing learners for their next stage and making sure that they have a good understanding of that labour market data and where the future employment opportunities are going to be. And to do that, there's two things we need to do. One is embed the data and labour market information within our planning, make sure that the curriculum has that alignment, but also it's about signposting students through advice and guidance to those opportunities. But a few of the key words then in the second and third points that we've underlined. So we have local, regional and national context. And that's mentioned quite a lot within the inspection handbook. And you will have a good understanding of this in your local economy, no doubt, by talking to employers, talking to local business communities and other stakeholders. But labour market information is a great way to provide that benchmark, to get that platform from where to start in planning, particularly in areas where you're not as familiar with. So maybe when you spread out into that kind of regional and national economy, labour market data is a great way to get that platform. So some of the key reasons why we use LMI, we've touched on this just now, but ensure that curriculum is aligned with local, regional and national labour markets. Often quite difficult to do that just by talking to employers, so labour market information gives us a great way to get that benchmark. We can identify opportunities for new courses. So where we see opportunities in the data where we haven't currently got curriculum, we can develop courses to fit into that. But we can also see where there's room to offer more of a particular course, so a greater volume. And we see that when we start uploading our course data and see where maybe we're not putting enough people out into the labour market to meet demand. And what we can do then is consider how to develop more of that particular course. We can also scale back provision, and we see more and more of this now. So colleges, training providers, just paring back on provision, which has not quite got that labour market alignment. But really importantly, we can look at what the labour market looks like in the future, and we can have a clear strategy of provision that we might need to grow or shrink accordingly to reflect that. We can also adapt course content, and often people think that looking at labour market data, there's going to be some big revolutionary change that we see in the data, a big industry that we've not spotted coming. And whilst that can happen, and more now what we see using the really refined skills data that we have within the tools, that the changes can be really subtle. So it may be making slight changes to course content to reflect particular skills that's needed by certain employers in a certain sector. So please bear that in mind when you get into the data. So next, we're going to think about how you will use labour market data in your labour market information in your planning process. And what I always say as part of this preparing to use the labour market information is think about how you use it as part of your overall research strategy. And by research, so if you just look at the box on the left-hand side there, the darker green box. So whatever you are doing to get a really good picture of what's happening within the economy, and that kind of broader research piece. So that could be Ofsted or the other regulatory bodies. It could be LMI. It could be looking at your local enterprise partnership priorities, things like analysis of existing provision, getting employer from feedback and students and talking to each other. And all that kind of comes together to give you that robust research picture before you start your curriculum plan or strategy. From there, we're going to develop ideas and plans. So it could be whether this capacity to run a new course. We're then going to test the ideas or the plans. So we're going to talk to employers, we're going to talk to the LEP, and maybe develop up business cases and then implement the changes. So maybe that is the actual development of the new course. So just a simple, easy framework to think about there. Just thinking about LMI as part of that overall research plan. We never condone just to use LMI. We always say, triangulate that by talking to employers, talking to the LEP, using other research and other data which is available to you. So I want you to think a little bit about how you will use LMI in your planning process. There are lots of different approaches, and what I'm going to share next is just a few examples of experiences that we see in colleges. But throughout this section, please think about what will work best for you in your institution. So a typical planning process, and it is, this is very typical. It's a generic process that we see used in lots of colleges. So just to talk through this, typically there will be some kind of a planning launch, including some headline LMI. That might be getting all curriculum stuff together for a day and talking about what's happening in the broader context. So that could be in terms of Ofsted or other regulatory bodies, what's their key themes, what's happening in the broader economy. There could be all those kind of things discussed at that first session. And then very typically there is a number of planning meetings. But for the purpose of this diagram, I've put 3. Sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's 3, sometimes it's 4. But typically there are a number of planning meetings which involves members of maybe the senior management team, the relevant curriculum staff. And each one of these meetings is looking at the viability of a program, maybe the viability of a curricular area, so the numbers of students on that program, the budgetary requirements, but also possibly considering that labour market alignment as well. And then at the end, there is generally some kind of approval or sign-off session. Some people call that a curriculum purchase. So where could LMI be considered? It can be considered at any one of those stages or all of them. And what we're going to look at next is just some examples of that, again, from experience of what we see. So first is a front-loaded example. This tends to happen in some kind of a pre-meeting. Typically, the head of each curriculum department will meet with a senior person responsible for LMI or planning, whether that's a deputy principal, or we see that sometimes as the director of marketing or the director of MIS, but it can vary from organisation to organisation. And what that session typically does is there'll have been some labour market data produced, typically looking at the Emsi data, and that pre-meeting will kind of scrutinise that data and make sure that the curriculum has that alignment and those kind of conversations are picked up before the formal planning process starts. Next session is example is similar to that, but typically at this stage, the LMI is considered within that first planning meeting. So examples I've seen, the first planning meeting may be taken up by looking at that curriculum vision, the strategy, where that curriculum area is going in the future. and how the provision meets labour market information. How the provision meets that employer demand and labour market alignment. And finally, as an example, and again, we've seen some really sound examples of this in our time working with colleges, is that labour market information is considered at every single meeting. So at the start, maybe, or the end of every meeting, there's that sense check about why are we running this provision? Does it meet the needs of our broader economy? So, that's not to say that any one of these examples will work for your college. It's about finding the right way, and your account manager will support you to find the best way. But what we want to do at this stage is just show you some examples about how the data can be used. So what works best? Important to say that there's no right and wrong, but what is really important is that LMI as a home, it's owned by someone and it's embedded. And we know that that's the key to getting results from using data within your planning process. So by that, we mean agreeing the strategy for things like how we'll use the data to make decisions. It's all well and good using the data, but what are we going to do with the data? How are we going to use it to inform decision-making and strategy? Will we prioritise resources based on the data, for example? So if you know that a particular area is going to grow into the future, there's a really good investment case there to develop provision. How are you going to then think about utilising colleges' resources to rally around that? Ownership of producing the data and owning the data is very important. So even if the data is going to be exported by people, for example, heads of department, so lots of different people are going to use the Emsi tool. Even if you're going to do that, it's important for somebody to have overarching ownership of that and make sure that people are using the data in a consistent way. What we don't want to do is people just using the data to show anything. And as we all know, we can put the spin on the data to validate a point. We're not trying to trick each other with this. We're trying to use the data to provide robust understanding of the labour market. So making sure there's a framework in there of how you're going to use the data is important, particularly if you're going to disperse that to multiple people within the team. Ownership of the process and integration. So similar to what I've just said, but this kind of links back into where you're going to use the data. So a bit like we've just looked at the previous examples, at what stage of the process are you going to consider the data? And then finally, the scrutiny and challenge. So who at those curriculum planning meetings is going to be the LMI champion? Who's going to be the one who remembers to test and push and really focus on curriculum alignment? I know from experience often that those meetings can soon change direction into things like financial viability and average class sizes and staff utilisation, and it's keeping that sense check on the LMI element as well. So harnessing LMI to drive action. How do we apply this to your way of working? And it's important really to consider this and give some thought, talk to different members of staff across the organisation, think about what's going to work best for you, who's going to produce the data, how are you going to make decisions based on the data, how are you going to test the data, how are you going to scrutinise that. So really start to think about that and get a clear plan before you actually start to get into the Emsi tools. So 3 key steps to success. Firstly, we always say jump straight in. Get into the data, get into the tool, upload your completion data, share reports with colleagues. The best way to understand the data is to get in there and start to have a play around, pull out some reports, talk to colleagues in your organisation, talk to your account manager, and really get an understanding of what's in there. Clarify who owns the LMI element. So alongside doing that, make sure that you've got that champion in place, make sure that you've got somebody who's coordinating how you're going to use the data and making sure that it's embedded in the process. And on that, then make sure the LMI is built into that process. So don't just say it's going to be, make sure that you've got clear, visible integration so that everybody who's involved with the curriculum planning process, whether that be curriculum staff or business support staff, have got a really clear insight as to how that's going to be used, and they're really wide acceptance that labour market data is going to be a key element of the curriculum planning process. So that concludes the video for today. I hope you found that useful. And please, if you need further information and support, work with your account manager. The implementation phase is really important. So please make sure you give that adequate time before starting to use the Emsi tools.
Thank you for your time today. Keep an eye out for other Emsi Learn modules.